Mm-hmm. Yes.
Very excited because Julia is going to be giving us her talk about Merleau-Ponty. So just to introduce Julia, Dr. Julia Cayne, who completed her PhD thesis on learning about the unknown and developing a methodology to explore such phenomena. She's involved with the Southern Association for Psychotherapy and Counselling, which provides training in critical existential analytic psychotherapy, as well as supervising doctoral research through Roehampton University. Her psychotherapeutic practice is located in deepest, darkest Wiltshire. So Julia is going to be speaking today about language as gesture in Merleau-Ponty, some implications for method in therapeutic practice and research. Julia, thanks so much.
Thanks for that, Sally. And the funny, it's funny hearing about the doctoral research and hearing the title, because I'd forgotten all about that. And actually, it's really important here, because a lot of what I'm saying really subverts so much of what I was doing in that project. Although I came to the conclusion that there were huge problems with method. At that time, I kind of moved on even from that now. So the talk that I'm going to give now comes from the paper that was published in the journal, but I'm not really going to repeat that paper. My thought was that I would just try and give a summary of some of the threads that I sort of picked up in that paper. And then I rather intend to kind of let them go like a frayed edge and then move into trying to say, what, if anything, has any of that got to do with questions about evidence-based practice? So, so I'm going to start, I hope, by sharing my screen. Can everyone see it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what I want to do is, first of all, summarise some of the points that I brought up in this paper. And what the paper did was to kind of look at learning, language, the body and play, and practice, psychotherapeutic practice. And that paper came from a game that I invented, or rather I didn't invent it, that got invented with my grandchildren. We were playing and something new emerged and we suddenly invented a game. And I took that invention as happening through a series of what I thought of as gestures. And that got me thinking about Winnicott, but also language. And I was thinking of language because adults obviously speak more than adults on the whole don't tend to chuck things at you and do all sorts of things that children do. So I began to think about language as a series of gestures. So that paper sort of took an interest in how we learn and how new things occur to us. And new was really more about how as individuals we come to something previously unthought of. Not these kind of universal news that research so often thinks we should be seeking. Through the work of Merleau-Ponty, I looked at language, which he viewed as gestural. Similar to a child playing with a toy, we also play with language. And something in language for Merleau-Ponty, something gets communicated through the body. And it can seem that we're in charge of language, but actually it's the other way around. Language doesn't represent something. It's doing something, it's gestural. And we're kind of bathed in language in some ways. The paper also looked at how language is related to bodily phenomena. And I've put body, mind, body, soul, but Merleau-Ponty speaks of the flesh. And so, although I'm talking about the body, and I do mean the physical body, I also don't mean the physical body. I mean something so much more than that. And anyway, in other words, Merleau-Ponty sees speaking as being, as words, as being something being propelled through our body as a result of our emotional, sensual experiencing. And language is infused with a kind of primal layer that is hidden. Perhaps another word, thinking of Manu's talk, would be something enigmatic is going on. There's also the idea that our body knows before our consciousness, and yet we locate thought in our mind. There was also the idea that our body responds to what is happening, but some ways of approaching questions of experience hinder that kind of knowing. I think we've somehow learned to phase out our body. We don't listen to what we're experiencing and communicating. And finally, phenomenology seems to me to call to experience having primacy over theory and research, which are seen as abstractions. So that was kind of some of the things that were raised in the paper. And I should add that some of us involved with SAFPAC have seen therapy as a kind of process of returning to learning from experience. So learning and experience have always been really important to me in therapy. So what I'd like to do now is to move on and actually tell you a couple of stories, just two short stories as a way of moving in to saying more about evidence-based practice. I'll stop my screen sharing, I think, for a moment. So the two stories are, and these just came to mind just in the last day or two. Two things. Many years ago, I was a nurse, and I was doing a post-qualifying undergraduate course in nursing. I'd been working on the wards for 12, 14 years. And I went off and did this course. And the first year of the course was known as the remedial year, which I had to do. So I was in the remedial class. And not only that, I didn't have a clue what it was we were about. I really struggled. I read stuff. I was introduced to all sorts of things like Marx and phenomenology and psychology, and I didn't really get it somehow. I didn't know how I didn't get it. And I remember at the start of the second year, we had a different tutor, and she started to kind of engage with us about our ideas and what we'd been thinking, and started to write it up on a big whiteboard as a spidergram, if you know what spidergram. And I'd never been taught in that way, but it was this diagram on the wall that just did something. I realised that I'd realised something. But I didn't know what I'd realised, but I realised that I'd realised something. And I think what I would say today is that I think what I suddenly realised was that you could play around with these ideas and move them around. And that made the most huge difference to what I wrote, how I was thinking, and it's very difficult to communicate. It was a pivotal moment in my own learning journey. The other story that I would like to tell you about was a little more recently than that. Was my daughter and I were both I'd been interested in Winnicott for some time, and my daughter was doing a placement at a special needs school as part of her teacher training. And she came home one day and told me the story about a little boy who was autistic, and the idea that autistic children don't have imaginative play. That was what she was being sort of told. And she had watched this little boy, they'd gone for a swimming lesson, and he was laying on his back floating, and he was watching the iron girders in the ceiling of the swimming pool, following them. And she said to me, do you know, she said, I think he was playing. And, that went against all that she'd been taught about this child didn't play. She thought this was really important. So I kind of asked myself, why have I told you about those two things? And I think it's more and more I've come to believe that we learn invaluable things from such singularities, from single experiences that we speak of and explore with other people. And I think they help us to be thoughtful without an expectation that we will apply any of that learning to our practice in a deliberate way. It's quite different to apply or base our practice in abstractions than to allow it to come through our bodies in the moment. And this relates a lot to the idea of the gesture, that our clients speak to us in gestural ways, and often we fail to respond to them in a similar vein. I think we don't often talk about learning actually in therapy, but Donald Shon had some really interesting ideas about learning in a practice discipline, which he said, you know, a practice discipline is not reducible to clearly solvable problems that fall easily within identifiable categories of what is already known. He saw such categorization of the world as based in a technical, rational epistemology. And he said it doesn't, those kind of things don't help us deal with unique situations. The thing with Shon is he said there will always be unique situations that crop up, but I think I would go further and say our practice is unique all the time. You know, in every moment that we're working with people, it's unique, it's different, it's new. And also, I think language is important here in that meaning slips and slides around. And so, for example, common words that are being used these days, like depression and anxiety, I hear it everywhere. But actually, these things mean very different people, very different things to different people at different times.
3 minutes, Julia.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm interested in our experiencing, and it seems to me a mistake to prioritise evidence as the way in which it's come to me over being. So I want to go on now and say something about, sorry, I just kind of want to just jump over something. So I want to raise questions about phenomenological research that's empirical research, and the problem that Merleau-Ponty raises, where such kind of knowing gets in the way of our knowing in the moment, the knowing that we gain through our experience, and the idea that our bodies already know and will guide us, and through gestures. This means something like allowing ourselves to be absorbed by what we're doing. To move one's body is to allow oneself to respond to the call of the other person, which is independent of any representation. And I take representation to mean predetermined ideas about people, such as evidence. So in summary, whilst theory and research are helpful in hearing about the experiences of others, it does seem to me to be a mistake to give primacy to those over our own experiencing in the moment. I once asked someone if he believed what others told him over the evidence of his own eyes, and he answered yes. I thought that this was terribly undermining for him. And I think that that's true for us as well, that when we intervene our own experiencing too quickly or too much with theory and research, we ourselves, our very being is undermined. And I would go so far as to say we become estranged from ourselves and other people. It's also quite different to read evidence that has categorised people's experience to hearing the story of a single case. I was recently asked if I've ever read any research that helped me in my practice.
1 minute, Julia.
What came to mind was the research I'd read about a therapist's work with an elderly woman who had dementia, a single case study. The story conveyed the therapist's struggle assumptions and the difficulties, as well as the unexpected moments of connection in the work. I didn't go on to apply that in my work, but it got me thinking. It had possibility, it had potential, but not yet realised. And possibility is concerned with what might bring something alive and new, something that breaks through the rigidities of pre-existing knowledge. And Kierkegaard saw a reliance on that kind of knowledge as leading us into despair.
Julia, we're going to have to finish any second.
Okay, so with regard to evidence-based practice, my position is that the issue depends on what you mean by evidence. to base one's practice on evidence that has been abstracted from the individual experience is problematic when one understands the nature of language and experience as temporal, contextual, provisional. True gestures are not about objectively representing things, but are rather expressions through the body of sensual, emotional experience. We don't understand the gesture of others by intellectual interpretation or by applying prepared techniques, but rather through attending to our bodily experiencing. Our body is our guide.
Thank you so much. That's it. Thank you so much. That opens up so much, doesn't it, in terms of the way in which we sit with the clients and how we are. 5 minutes. Has anybody got any questions or comments, observations for Julia to share?
Laura, hi.
Laura.
Hi, Julia. Yeah, I was thinking so much about what I loved reading your paper, and I love listening to you now, and really nice actually to see each other. But I've been thinking a lot about Merleau-Ponty. He's a philosopher I go back to again and again. And well, the last time I was in Paris before the lockdown, I was in a bookshop and looking at a book in French, an edition of a lecture course you'd given. And I was just browsing it. And I don't remember what I'd taken from it, but I think I took something because I found myself continuing to think after it. And I think it was like Beyond said, if something has had an effect on you, you forget it. So whatever it is I browsed in the bookshop had gone into my unconscious, as if I was in Merleau-Ponty's consulting room, although he never was an analysis and he never trained. And then more recently, I bought the translation, and I read the first lecture. It was just notes, and thought, oh, what do I do? Do I read the lectures one by one and think about them as if I had gone to his seminar? And I found that's what I did. I haven't read the second lecture, even though when I read the outline of the lecture course, which he put together in order to get permission to give the lecture course, there was a lot about what was in each lecture and what changes he made, which seemed very intellectual and sort of to do with what's given and how we don't change that. But the actual lecture outlines are completely up in the air and open. And I think that's what I heard in your stories about your grandchildren and your daughter and running up against constraints to do with teaching and education and the whole question of research and psychoanalysis. So I just wanted to thank you for that.
Thanks, Laura. I just want, you just reminded me of something actually that I just had a note in a margin which I didn't have time to say, which is that there is something about, and I think this is what Merleau-Ponty also writes about, how things call to us. We never know what will call to us, how it will call to us. I once worked with a Polish woman who sometimes couldn't express herself except to speak in Polish. I didn't understand a word of it, but it didn't kind of matter at times. Sometimes it did, often not. There's something about what gets called to us, and I think of the call as being something that comes through our sensual experiencing, through our bodies. And it doesn't make sense to us often, immediately, if ever. But it doesn't, that's this way of thinking so subverts notions of evidence-based practice. It just really does, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. And we're really at time.